let's just punch on through this thing. During the compression stroke, the piston moves down in the cylinder and the intake valve is open. Now you can read that, huh? That's false, you know. Okay, think about your compression. What you got, the first thing, what's the first stroke? If you were going to put a stroke first, hey, come on, and you didn't miss hardly nothing. Good deal. You got everything, don't you? Wow, look at all that. Grab your stuff out of your cubby hole over there, Chelsea. During the compression stroke, what's going on?
During the compression stroke?
Yeah. What are you compressing? Tell me about what the compression
The valves are closed.
Fuel in the air.
Yeah, the fuel in the air. How does it get in there?
Through the intake valve.
All right. During what stroke?
Intake stroke.
Intake stroke. It's going to be going down.
Yeah, and then it comes back up.
And then when the valve closes,
Just
in other words, after it comes all the way down, the valve's going to close. It's going to go up and it's going to squeeze that air. And the difference in the travel, like if you take the amount of space that's in that combustion chamber with that piston all the way down, and you take the amount of space in the combustion chamber with it all the way up, it's going to be something to one, basically. In other words, if it's 8 to 1, it's 8 times as big. The chamber is 8 times as big whenever the piston is all the way down as it is when it's all the way up. So it's 8 to 1, 12 to 1. A diesel engine has from 18 to 20 to 1. And that's why the compression on a diesel is 400 or 500 pounds. It's really high. And it's got, on a diesel engine, and these are basic engine principles, on a piston-driven engine, we talked about this a little bit in previous semesters, but on a gasoline engine, not a piston-driven, gasoline engine, all of the fire goes out by the time the piston has moved about that far in the cylinder. Did you know that? All of the fire's gone out. It's just you're slapping the top of that piston. So imagine yourself, you know, trying to get work done with something slapping the top of the pistons in order. You know, because every time it's got to happen in the right place during the piston travel whenever it's on. So your spark is going to happen, and everybody understands what top dead center is, right? Does anybody in here doesn't know what I'm talking about when I say top dead center? Top dead center means that well, let's start by looking at a crankshaft. This right here. This is a crankshaft. It's made out of aluminum. No, it's not. It's actually pretty heavy. Okay, see the piston, the connecting rod is connected around this. Okay, when that is on the very bottom and in the middle, that's bottom dead center. When it's on the very top and in the middle, that's top dead center. And that's a crankshaft position as relates to that particular piston and connecting rod. So when that piston has gone as high as it's going to go, and it has stopped moving, and then it's going to start going back down, you actually, when you've arrived at top dead center, there's that little moment when the piston is just kind of stopped and it's getting ready to change direction. That's what top dead center is. That's not too hard to understand once you get that grasped. You're going to see that in that handout that I wrote. I wrote that handout and I put the pictures in there and all that. I know it looks really professional and everything because most of what I do looks really professional. That's actually published on my website too, by the way. That AskAMechanic.info website I've got. Okay, so what you have here is whenever you're at top dead center, you come up to top dead center on a 4-cycle engine, 4 strokes per cycle. You're going to come up 2 times during that. So you got 720 degrees of crankshaft rotation for each cycle. If I turn that engine right over there, that's a 3-liter engine. It never was put in any car. It's a brand new engine, came from Ford. But it's a 2000 Taurus. It's a 3-liter. If I turn that engine 2 full turns and I was able to capture all the air that went in and all the air that came out, I'd have 3 liters of air in a bag. That's what that means. When you got a 3-liter engine, it's going to displace 3 liters of air. It's going to pull that much in, it's going to pump that much out. Did you know that? That's what it is. Now, volumetric efficiency relates to how many curves the air has to go around on the way to the cylinder. Because what these intake systems are all about is getting the same amount of everything to all the cylinders. You don't want one cylinder getting more gas in air than the other ones because it's not going to balance. So that's why you have a plenum. See, that plenum captures the air and it actually creates an even amount of pressure all the way around. And I hate it whenever my computer times out. But so I'm just trying to cover this stuff while I'm thinking about it, so I don't, leave you with any Swiss cheese in what we're trying to learn here. The piston moves, now down your test, the first question was a spark ignition fuel injected engine requires 6 basic systems, and that's true. During the compression stroke, the piston moves down in the cylinder and the intake valve is open. That is false, because during the compression stroke, the piston's going up and all the valves are closed, okay? Connecting rod connects the crankshaft to the camshaft. Okay, correct. I mean, you're saying false, you're saying the right answer. This is the piston, this is a connecting rod. See that? Everybody knows what a connecting rod is, and this is the piston with brand new rings on it. Okay, you know, whenever the piston is doing this, right? This is top dead center. This is bottom dead center. Top dead center, bottom dead center. And this is the crankshaft doing that. Now, if you've got a piston that's bigger, the diameter of the piston is bigger than the amount that it travels. See that? If it's exactly the same, like on a Chevy, it's about 4 inches, just under 4 inches, right? Which is real close to this. This is, I think this is out of a 302. But one way or another, this 4 inches, if it's 4 inches here and it travels 4 inches, that is called a square engine, right? If the piston is bigger than the travel, in other words, if it's got a 4.5 inch bore, this amount that it travels up and down is called the stroke. The diameter of that piston is called the bore. Okay, if it travels up and down, say 3.5 inches, and the piston is 4.5 inches, it is over square. If the piston is little, but it travels a long way, it's under square. I had a Jeep, old Jeep, Willis Jeep, like 47 model, that I traded my cousin out of. And I went, believe it or not, in those days, and that wasn't, well, it was quite a few years ago, but I went to Dothan Auto Parts, and they had all the parts on the shelf to rebuild that 47 Willis Jeep. I couldn't believe it. Piston rings, gaskets, everything you needed. So I bought all that stuff, and I think I paid $50 for all those parts. And I put it back, and I used the piston, but it had rods about that long and little pistons about as big around. But it was a seriously under square engine. But what is the difference? What do you get if you've got a short stroke?
It's a higher rev engine.
It's going to rev faster, right? But you won't have as much torque.
Right.
And how do we remember that? Where do we come up with that? If I've got a crank, I'm talking about just a plain old crank. And wait a minute, let me draw that so that the camera can see it. If I've got a crank right here, I didn't draw that, right? Did I? I'm going to draw that, like that. I'm going to draw that crank. And I make a short crank, I can turn it really fast, can't I? Like on your little jack in the box. Turn it real fast. And that's what this crank shaft is doing, except it's got all these different throws at different. But if I've got a long stroke, see the short, when it's short here, that's a short stroke. When it's a long here, it's a longer stroke, and you got more torque. Now in the diesel engine, you know, I told you the gas engine is just slapping the top of the piston. On a diesel engine, the fuel's burning all the way down. And so that means it's like you're pumping that sucker. If I'm pumping this crank, I'm going to do more work, and I have a lot more torque than if I'm just going slapping it and letting it go on around. See what I'm saying? And that's the difference between gas and diesel. Diesels typically don't rev as high unless it's something like an old Volkswagen Rabbit or one of those Toyo Kojo Mazda engines. They run about 6,000 RPM when they're a diesel. But anyway, think about that. I mean, just reduce it to the least common denominator. Think about the length of your crank. That's how you can remember that a engine that's got a short stroke and a big bore is going to rev fast, but it ain't going to have a lot of torque. That's, you know, good for some of your different types of racing. Okay, let me move on here and try to get us out of here quicker than this. Okay. A spark ignition engine and a compression ignition engine differ in the kind of fuel they use. If you look at the top of an oil can, and it has, it'll have SF or C or S something. It'll always have an S for spark-fired ignition. If it's got a a C, it'll be for compression fired. You can take the oil like Shell Rotella or something you put in a diesel, and typically, now I say typically because things are changing, but typically it's okay to use compression fired oil in a spark fired engine. That don't usually cause any trouble if the weight's about right. But you don't need to ever try using spark fired oil in a compression fired engine because it can't handle the blow by from all that. You know, so just keep that in mind. Nowadays though, you have to put, in most of these newest engines, and I'm getting to, getting to the point where if it's about a 2005 model or newer, you better put whatever oil they say to use. For years, I would just pour 2050 Castrol in everything I drove. I mean, personally. But it's always better, like on some of these 3-valve Fords, what you'll end up having to do, if you put oil in there that's the wrong weight, you're going to have issues. It's not going to run right. It'll make some noise and this kind of stuff. The little tiny orifices in these hybrid vehicle engines and all that kind of stuff are such that whenever they, the valves, the way they work, and some of the cylinders, they drop out, they stop. You got to have the right exact oil in those. You've also got to have exactly the right amount of air in the tires and all kinds of other stuff on hybrid vehicles, because everybody's looking at their mileage. I was getting 98 miles to the gallon. Now I'm only getting 96, and it was after you worked on it.
Yeah.
And it's usually tied to something like the, you did something to the air pressure in the tires. I mean, there's at least a little bit of change in. They're watching that, which can be a pain, but that's how it was. Air induction system keeps the engine at safe and efficient operating temperature.
Is that true?
Wait a minute. What is the air induction system for?
Take
Air induction system. Okay, 4 was true. 5 is basically going to be false. The air induction system is the intake, guys. The intake manifold that captures the air. I wrote an article for Motor Age, and I need to print some of these Motor Age articles I wrote. I got PDFs of them called "Capturing Atmosphere." It talks about intake manifolds and the different ways they build them and all that kind of stuff. But that's it. You're just capturing air and shoving it in there. Got to be filtered. A piston stroke takes place when the piston moves from TDC to BDC, top dead center to bottom dead center, right? A stroke. Or from BDC to TDC, that's true. If it's moving from bottom dead center to top dead center or vice versa, it's a stroke. In a compression ignition engine, the piston compresses the air and the fuel mixture until the spark plug ignites it.
That's true.
Yep. No, wait a minute, think about what I'm saying. Whoop, whoop. I was hoping somebody would call him down on that. A compression
No, it's a glow
ignition. Well, actually, the glow plug, we need to talk about that a second too. The glow plug, well, now listen to this. You get 2 degrees Fahrenheit for every pound of compression. For when you squeeze the air is going to heat up 2 degrees for every pound of compression. Okay, so if you've got 450 pounds of compression on a diesel, the piston goes all the way down. The piston comes to within 40 thousandths of an inch of that cylinder head. It comes that close. Now, on that picture you got, that's a diesel piston. See that? All right, so that little bowl in there, that's actually the combustion chamber, because the diesel's got a flat cylinder head, totally flat, and the only place there's anything can be is in where that bowl is. Well, by that time, you're at 1,000 degrees, right? You shoot some gas in there, or some fuel, not gas. What am I saying? See, I'm a total buffoon myself talking about gas versus diesel. You squirt some diesel fuel in there under really high pressure where it's atomized, it's going to light off. The heat, though, and listen to this, you said glow plugs, and that's why I'm going here. The heat that's created by the compression is going to be absorbed by the cold metal of the engine if it's been sitting out in 10-degree weather all night. So if you fire up those glow plugs, they create enough heat to where the heat from the compression works with the glow plug heat, and your glow plugs ain't burning all the time. See what I'm saying? They only burn when you first turn it on, and sometimes briefly after you start it. If you ever see a diesel engine that skips a little after you start it, makes some white smoke, you've usually got a glow plug that's burned out. That's typically the way that works. I mean, there's a lot of variations there, but just remember that. Okay, compression fired engine. Engine compresses air and fuel mixture. The spark of the spark plug does not ignite it. It fires on compression. During the intake stroke of a 4-stroke engine, the piston moves up in the cylinder. Wrong. That's false. During the exhaust stroke of a 4-stroke engine, the piston forces the burn gases out through the open exhaust port. That is true. Pulls it in during intake. Squeezes it. Fires. And then during the exhaust stroke, it goes out. Some of the guys that are kind of what we always use, the guys in the shop, and most of the time you got guys working in the shop, they have this little, these little memory game things. So if you can remember, and this is usually pretty easy to remember, and just so that somebody will have a memory bug for it, suck, squeeze, bang, blow. Can you remember that in that order? That's how it goes. Intake, compression, power, and exhaust. Remember that. Intake, compression, power, and exhaust. Say that, Brandon. Intake, compression, power, and exhaust.
Intake,
compression,
power, exhaust.
All right, Chelsea?
Intake, compression, power, exhaust.
Okay, you other guys?
Intake, compression.
Power and exhaust, in that order. Intake's the first one because you're not gonna air to squeeze, you're not doing anything. So remember, you gotta pull the air in. Intake, compression, power, and exhaust. How many of you know that if the air filter is completely clogged up with mud because the guy drove it into the drink, the car's not gonna start? This really sharp mechanic got a no start on a Mustang one time and couldn't figure out what was going on with that thing. And finally, when he took the air filter out, after he worked on it an hour trying to figure out why it wouldn't start, the air filter was completely clogged with mud. And the kid had drove it into the drink and had his buddy drag it out of the drink, and he washed that sucker real good. And he washed the engine and cleaned it up really, really good and everything, but he didn't think about the air filter. And it wouldn't start, so he just said, hey, Dad, for some reason my Mustang won't start. So he came in on the hook, and they brought it in over there, and he worked. That air filter weighed 10 pounds. I ain't kidding you. That thing had so, but he couldn't get any air. You know what I mean? There's another thing I told you guys about before. Donnie's over working on this car, and it won't start. You remember when I told you this story? He got working, it wouldn't start, it's a little V6. And he goes, I cannot figure out why this car won't start over here. And I've been watching him from a distance, and he's a sharp cookie now. He was no dummy. You know, this guy's been doing this work as long as I was, but he was just too close to it, and he was beating his head against the wall. And he says, he said, it's got compression, it's got spark, it's in time, it's got fuel. He said, I don't know why it won't start. And I said, well, pull 3 of the spark plugs out. Just on one bank, just pull 3 of the spark plugs out. So he did. Now what? I said, try to start it. He tried to start it, and boom, 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 it started up, and it sounded like a machine gun, you know, because of pop, 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 pop. He said, what does that mean? He's totally fuddled. I said, it means the exhaust is stopped up. He says, well, how did you know that? I said, I don't remember. I learned that somewhere. I can't even remember how I came to know that. But I says, if you pull 3 of the plugs out and it starts when it wouldn't start any other kind of way, that you know it can't breathe. And it just needed, it's like you got a smaller engine and you're not, you know, that kind of thing. But anyway, I thought you guys would appreciate that story. But yeah, I got lots of stories, and you may hear me tell them more than once. So, you know, don't go, you made me forget my password. All right. Okay, now then. Number 10. Now these are multiple guess, right? If not tightly sealed, the piston clearance allows some of the compressed air and fuel mixture to leak past the pistons. Blow by. You've got blow by on brand spanking new engines. Now here's another rule of thumb. You make 1 gallon of water for every gallon of gas you burn. How many of you have noticed on a cold day, you crank it up, you got all that steam coming out your pipe. You're making water. You're making water all the time. You're just making it when it's cold. You just can't see it unless it's cold. And you got steam coming out your pipe. You crank up a brand new car. You can go to the showroom up here at J.M. Jackson. You can fire up a brand spanking new car, and you're going to see water dripping out the exhaust pipe. Just dripping out until it warms up, and then it's so hot in there that the vapor. All right, now let me hit you with this. You crank that engine up, and you're getting some blow by, and there's going to be some moisture and all because you're making the water and all that kind of stuff. And you drive it over here about a mile before you shut it off, and you haven't really let it warm up. And Granny, she goes back and forth to the store, and that's all she does. And then about 5, 6 years down the road, she's got a car. Oh my gosh, it doesn't have very many miles on it. What, like 25,000 miles on it? And it's like 10 years old. Man, I want that car. That thing's tight, it's fresh, it's brand new. And the first time you head for Birmingham on it, all of that sludge that built up in the engine there, these little short drives when it didn't have a chance to warm up, melts off of and goes down in the oil pan and clogs up the screen and starves it for oil, and you've destroyed the engine. That kind of thing happens. My brother-in-law bought a car like that. Low mileage, mom and pop Acura. And he was just, oh man, you know, this is a cat's meow and all that. So first time, and it was just $4,400, like a beautiful brand new, it was like a 93 model. And he headed off for Birmingham on that thing, and halfway back the motor locked up in there. It was a mom and pop, you know, car that was just absolutely pristine. Beautiful car, but there's a lot you can't see. And anyway, make sure that you always remember that. I told my wife that when we first got married. I says, never, ever, ever start your car if you're not going to warm it all the way up. It needs to be completely warm when you shut it off. Don't crank it up, pull it out of the yard, wash it, and pull it back in. You do that, you know, a couple of times a week, you're going to have a sludge that thick on the inside of everything for a while. And that's you know, they used to have Chevy cars sludging their engines up really bad. People blamed it on Quaker State oil. I'm serious. That's hogwash. There ain't nothing wrong with Quaker State oil. Quaker State oil is as good as any other oil you can use. Matter of fact, I worked with a guy one time at that big dealership, and he made a remark to somebody that Quaker State oil would sludge up an engine, And that got back to Quaker State, and they came down on him like a jackhammer. And they said, you better not ever say anything about that again, because you cannot scientifically prove Quaker State oil has ever sludged up any engine. And it don't. So as long as you keep it oil changed and you let it warm up, you run it good and warm. You see people pull a thermostat out, what does the engine do when you pull a thermostat out?
Stays cool.
It's just too cold. Now every now and then you'll run into some yo-yo that believes something that's totally maybe true one time in 500, and he will argue like a fence post trying to tell you that you don't know what you're talking about. Like this one guy I met said, if you pull the thermostat out of a car, it will overheat. I said, what? He said, yeah. He said, it'll overheat. You'll burn that engine up. If you pull that thermostat out, it'll overheat. Wait a minute. I've been working on cars for about 10, 15 years at the time. And I said, that's nonsense. I said, I pull out a zillion thermostats. And whenever the thermostat comes apart so that it's open all the time, it's running cold as a post. Oh, no, you're going to burn up engines, and I'll rebuild them for you. I said, oh. Well, the thing about it is, what he was thinking about was, back in the mid-60s, some of the Mustangs had radiators on them that were really small. And if you pull the thermostat on one of those cars with a really thin, small radiator, the water went through the radiator too fast to get rid of its heat, and it would overheat if you pull the thermostat out. Well, that's only true in one car out of 500. And he was applying it to everything, you know what I'm saying? He thought he'd unlock the mysteries of the universe because he thought he was smarter than everybody else. But, and I'm not going to be so hard-headed about stuff like that. Well, I could be wrong, but I thought this is the way it works, you know? You can, and I've told other people, you might get really good at fixing cars and figure out stuff other people can't figure out. It doesn't give you a license to be a jerk. You know what I mean? You can be a nice guy. Share your knowledge. The more you tell other people, the smarter you'll get. That's all there is to it. You're working at a shop somewhere where the guy don't want to tell anybody anything he knows because he's afraid that he won't be as indispensable as he was. That's hogwash. You know, I used to tell him, I call people on the phone. You know, people call me on the phone. One guy called me from Africa one time.
Oh.
Yeah, I want to get a Jeep started. You know, and I says, he says, can you talk to these Italian mechanics over here? Yeah, I guess so. I said, I can't. I said, I want to talk to let me talk to the other man. What? The owner? Yeah, the owner. I don't understand what you're saying. So anyway, I told him some stuff to do, and I got the thing started, but good grief. But, and it's really surprising how people, if you'll just make yourself available to them, they'll call you. But this guy calls from Africa, I think the other side of the planet. It was a real strange phone call. Then I found out why he called me. He was from Geneva. And the only people, they didn't know anything about this Jeep because it had a strange fuel system, a fire ignition system on it. Anyway, I don't even remember how that story turned out in the end, but we got it started, and that was sort of a victory for me and all that. And, but anyway, this one guy would call me one time. He goes, can you help me with this guy? You know, some people they'd call, they'd say, I can't figure this out. I say, what's the fuel pressure? Huh? The fuel pressure. You check fuel pressure? Yeah. What was it? I don't remember. You didn't check the fuel pressure. Get off the phone and check the fuel pressure. That goes all the time. This one guy, he called, he says, can you help me? I was at the Ford place, the dispatcher called me up and handed me the phone. I said, you go to church? Huh? My son goes to church. Is that good enough? I said, no, you have to go to church Sunday if I'm going to help you. So anyway, but I helped him out. But pick at him. He called me. Don't give me no hard time. All right. So here we go. The intake valves. Incidentally, the blow-by is supposed to be handled by the PCV system, positive crankcase ventilation. Remember the Bronco, that stupid Bronco out there, the way that that happened, and I'm not answering that phone, they can just let it keep ringing. But the Bronco, we changed the oil in it and just did some basic stuff they wanted done. And I guess he drove it hard or something, four-wheeling it or whatever. He come back in and his mother says, this thing is leaking a lot of oil. And I said, really? She says, yeah. And so she pulled in here, and by the time she got here from Elba, that doggone thing wasn't even touching the stick. It didn't have a quart of oil left in it. And when you look up under there, the oil pan gasket was pushed out because the PCV system wasn't working. It was filling the blow-by was pumping the crankcase full of pressure, and it blew every seal on that doggone thing. It was nasty. And so I said, well, we're going to pull the oil pan off. This is last semester. We'll pull the oil pan off. We'll just drop the oil pan off, change the oil pan gasket right quick. Wrong. We had to pull the transmission out of that doggone thing. We couldn't jack the engine high enough up to get it clear. It looked like it was going to be fairly easy, but that oil pan would not come out of there. So they pulled the transmission out, they pulled the exhaust off, they jacked the motor out, and they got the oil pan. It was a
mess.
It was a mess. It was a big mess. It was one of those monster jobs that tries to eat you alive. But when we got through with it, it wasn't leaking oil. It was running good. And all this other work we done, somebody had put tape around the throttle cable where it was on the bracket, and they got about 10 miles out of town, paid the big bill, $500-600, whatever we charged them, and got out of town down there, and the throttle cable popped loose from the bracket because the guys, y'all didn't tape it back. It looked like it was going to stay, but she called me, hey, man, he can't give it no gas. It won't do nothing but idle. So I went down there and I said, the throttle cable probably came loose. I said, tell him to look at that. It's right on top. She goes, he don't know nothing about that. So I said, okay. So I drove down there and popped the hood and snapped it back in place. I said, okay, just be careful. It's just what you got to do if it pops loose again. So we ordered a throttle cable, and that was the last thing we had to do to that thing to get done with it. We put a throttle position sensor on it, idle air control. I mean, we did a bunch of stuff, but it was running smooth as silk when we got through.
Front rear main seal.
Huh? Yeah, rear main seal, front, seal, crankshaft seal. I mean, all the seals have, we didn't replace the valve cover gaskets because they weren't blown, but usually they'll blow too.
Was that the OJ or the baby Bronco?
That's a big one. That was a 302. Anyway, the intake valves, exhaust valves, and combustion chamber are all located where?
Cylinder head.
In the head. Now on that diesel piston that you got there, the combustion chamber is actually on the top of the piston. See that piston, that picture in that handout I gave you? Okay. Cylinders, pistons, and crankshaft are all located where?
Skip one.
In the engine block. That's going to be a D, right?
Skip number 12, sir.
Sorry about that. Skip number 12. The measure of how much the air-fuel mixture is compressed during the cylinder, the compression stroke is the what?
Well, I think
I told you that a while ago.
Ratio.
Compression ratio. Compression ratio.
That's that 3-letter number. I mean, three
Yeah,
number.
8 to 1, 12 to 1, something like that. All right, so, and when we're in driveline, we're doing something to ones that are talking about how many turns going in versus how many turns you got going out. And, all right, so I keep thinking there's somebody out there. Okay, let me see. The air filter, and throttle body are parts of the what?
air induction.
Air induction. That's the only good answer for that. The header pipe, catalytic converter, and muffler are parts of the what engine system? Exhaust. Bingo. All right. You people happy with that? You like that? All right. Now, I tell you what, make doggone sure that you read that. I'm liable to give you a pop test on that handout. So take that handout seriously. Okay? That concludes our class.